American government, civil rights. The Declaration of Independence of the United States proclaims that all men are created equal. Yet, when the Declaration of Independence was written, 1 in 6 Americans was enslaved. The civil rights of these slaves and many others in American society were not protected by the government. The civil right is a guarantee of equal opportunity and equal protection under the law, whereas civil liberties offer fundamental protections from the law. African slaves possessed the antithesis of civil rights. Slaves were first brought to America more than 400 years ago, a year before the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts. Slavery lasted for 250 years in the United States. In issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which legally freed the slaves of the rebelling Confederate States, not the Union States, Abraham Lincoln said, "I never in my life felt more certain I was doing right." Nevertheless, the repression of Black Americans did not end with the Civil War. After the war, the former Confederate States established a two-tiered race system. Blacks could not attend the same schools as whites, they could not use the same restrooms, they could not eat in the same restaurants or stay in the same hotels. The struggle of African Americans to achieve a fuller measure of their rights over the ensuing decades mirrors the struggle of other disadvantaged groups in our history and in global history, including women, Native Americans, Hispanics, Catholics, Jews, Mormons, and the LGBTQA+ community. Each group has had to fight to secure the rights and opportunities that others take for granted in the United States. Equality has always been the least well-defined of America's core values. Even Thomas Jefferson, who penned the words, "All men are created equal," in the Declaration, did not give equality precise meaning. But whatever it meant, and he meant, the writers of the Constitution knew instinctively that it was incompatible with slavery. Luther Martin, a Maryland delegate to the Constitutional Convention, argued forcefully in his writings at the time that state-sanctioned slavery was inconsistent with the principles of the American Revolution. When the framers met in 1787 to write the new Constitution, the issue of slavery nearly brought the convention to a halt. Slaves were concentrated in the southern states, which had a plantation economy. To many of the northern delegates, the writing of the Constitution presented an opportunity to phase out slavery, but for the southern state delegates, the idea was a non-starter. Many threatened to walk out on the convention and form their own union of states or government if slavery were to be abolished. The northern delegates gave in, negotiating a series of compromises in order to save the American Union. One such compromise was the Fugitive Slave Clause of the original Constitution. It required all states to return a runaway slave to their state of origin. A more contentious issue was whether slaves could be counted in determining a state's population by the census, which would affect the number of seats that would be held in the House of Representatives and thus influence the distribution of political power in the new country. Southern delegates wanted slaves to count one for one among their population. This is a little bit counterintuitive. And northern delegates didn't want to count them at all since they were being denied citizenship. After a heated debate, the delegates agreed to a compromise. Each slave was to be counted as 3/5 of a person, quite literally. This formula meant that the South would, after ratification, likely control about 45% of the House seats compared to under 40% it would have had if slaves were not counted at all. Ironically, counting slaves as whole people would have given the slave states more power in the Union and maybe even prolonged slavery. This was a forward-looking effort by Southern delegates. Based on what they were hearing during the debate at the convention, they knew that they would need a strong presence in Congress to stave off future and perhaps inevitable attempts to abolish their institution, which is already forming the economic cornerstone of their state economies. The northern states were able to wring a concession out of the Southern delegates in exchange for the preservation of slavery. They drafted a constitutional provision that gave Congress the power, after a 20-year period, to ban the importation of slaves. When that time came, Congress did in fact ban their import by law, which would eventually bring the slavery question to the forefront of American politics. 70 years after the Constitution was ratified and 50 years after the banning of slave imports from Africa, the Constitution's slave causes triggered the worst decision, arguably, in the Supreme Court's history. In its Dred Scott v. Sanford ruling of 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court concluded that African Americans, even the many hundreds of thousands who were not slaves, were not entitled to citizenships and were never intended to be citizens of the United States by its framers. The ruling upended decades of laws dealing with slavery, the slave trade, fugitive slaves, free enslaved territories, etc., and indirectly brought on the calamitous American Civil War. The highest court in the land had proven that it could not settle the slave question with integrity, so American soldiers and rifles would have to do so with blood. Less than a decade later, the closing of the Civil War brought an end to state-sanctioned slavery, but not to the abusive rights imposed upon the former slaves. Former slaves had hoped the war had assured them of their rights. The 14th Amendment, ratified in the war's aftermath, prohibited states from denying any of their residents equal protection under the law. But after the Union troops left the South, its white majority governments began to suppress the black population and confine them to second-class citizenship. In its infamous 1898 ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld the unequal arrangement that had taken shape in the South after the Civil War, arguing that separate facilities for blacks were constitutional so long as they were equal. Separate but equal became the infamous standard by which the Supreme Court would impose this ruling. Separate but equal became the mantra of Southern governments afterwards, who focused on creating a system of racial coexistence that preserved their white supremacy. The Southern arrangement was a terrible farce. Black children were forced to use white schools' worn-out books and desks. Black hospitals had to get by with inferior medical equipment. At times, Southern state governments didn't even bother with appearances. For decades, the state of Texas simply forbade black students from enrolling in its public law school without providing a separate alternative for its black citizens to enter the legal profession, let alone an equal one. The South's formalized system of racial discrimination came into sharp focus for the country during World War II. Hundreds of thousands of African American soldiers had helped defeat the Nazis in their fanatical brand of racism. 12 million Jews, Slavs, and others were murdered in Nazi concentration camps. At war's end, it was clear to more and more Americans that the United States had to divert from its two-tiered, race-based social order dominant across its South, lest it become Nazi Germany. In 1954, the Supreme Court took a step to rectify the discriminatory legal precedent it itself had set in place years earlier. In Brown versus the Board of Education, the court ruled that racially segregated public schools violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Critically, the court ruled that separate educational facilities are in fact inherently unequal, and that the separate but equal doctrine was damaging to black citizens. That decision enraged Southern whites because it threatened a final break from racial norms that had stood for nearly a century. Billboards on Southern highways called for the impeachment of Chief Justice Earl Warren. In Arkansas, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had dispatched federal troops to quell the violence surrounding the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. That is, the co-enrollment of black kids and white kids in the same schools and classrooms, the desegregation movement. Little Rock was not an isolated case. It took 500 U.S. Marshals and a U.S. Army unit to desegregate the University of Mississippi. As the first black student, James Meredith, entered the university, white students yelled out racial insults and constantly threatened Meredith as he went to class. The Brown decision set out an important precedent. It marked the first time the Supreme Court had forcefully applied the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. In ensuing years, the precedent served to advance the civil rights of other disadvantaged groups, not just African Americans. Women were one such group who benefited from the ruling. They were, for example, effectively barred by law from working in a number of different occupations, and many state laws deferred specific legal rights specifically to a woman's husband. Once the principle of separate but equal was invalidated by the Supreme Court, few laws that promoted inequality or differences could stand any longer. Today, due largely to the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, nearly all laws of such have been eliminated. One of the few that remains is registration for the United States military draft. At age 18, men are required to register for selective service, but women are not. The Supreme Court in 1980 upheld that law, arguing the government had a legitimate interest in protecting women from involuntary combat duty. Women can volunteer to serve in combat in time of war, but cannot be compelled to do so by American law. Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanics are among the other groups that have benefited from the Equal Protection Clause as well. An example is a 1982 Supreme Court decision striking down a Texas law that prohibited undocumented immigrant children from attending Texas public schools. The Equal Protection Clause is also served to protect same-sex couples. The Supreme Court applied the clause in 2015's Obergefell versus Hodges decision in striking down state laws prohibiting same-sex marriage. Writing for the court's majority, Justice Anthony Kennedy said, quote, "The generations that wrote and ratified the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment did not presume to know the extent of freedom in all of its dimensions. and so they entrusted to future generations a charter protecting the right of all persons to enjoy liberty. The Brown v. Board decision in 1954 undeniably signaled the beginning of the end to state-sponsored segregation. But public schools and hospitals were not the only segregated facilities across the South. Blacks were not allowed to use private hotels and restaurants reserved for whites. Even famous Black Americans like the singer Ella Fitzgerald and the baseball player Jackie Robinson were denied access to certain places of business as they traveled around the country. Notice that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits discrimination by government. It says nothing about discrimination by individuals and private citizens and businesses. Only in 1964, with passage of the Civil Rights Act, did discrimination by owners of public accommodations become outlawed. An Alabama restaurant owner challenged the law, arguing it violated his fundamental rights. The Supreme Court ruled otherwise, invoking the Constitution's Commerce Clause, which gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. The court held that Congress has the power to regulate local business activities, such as hotels and restaurants, as long as any part of that activity is related to interstate commerce, for example, an out-of-state employee needing a meal or a room. Passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 produced one of the most drawn-out fights in congressional history. Southern members of Congress tried every conceivable legislative tactic to defeat the bill, including a record-breaking 75-day Senate filibuster. They argued that Congress could not legislate morality, and that the bill and its 11 titles would inevitably produce unintended consequences Congress was not prepared to deal with. In essence, the prescriptive law would do more harm to the state of equality in America than the gradually weakening culture of discrimination among the American people itself. In the end, the votes in the House and Senate broke sharply along regional lines rather than party lines, with nearly every member of Congress from the South voting against the law, and nearly every member of the North and West, Republican or Democrat, voting for it. Public opinion was also divided along regional lines. A nationwide poll found that more than 90% of Northern whites and less than 50% of Southern whites thought blacks should be allowed to use the same parks, restaurants, and hotels as whites. There's another provision of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, one that prohibits job discrimination. It promised to be as important for women as for minorities. Many women had experienced sex discrimination in the workplace, specifically after the end of World War II. Less pay for the same work, less opportunity for promotion, less chance of being retained in a layoff. The Civil Rights Act attempted to reduce some of these inequalities, but generally failed to do so. One reason why is that job discrimination is difficult to actually prove. If 50 applicants apply for a job and a white man gets it, a woman or minority applicant has considerable difficulty proving in court that discrimination was the reason they didn't get that position. These limitations created demands for a policy that would turn the tables on alleged workplace discrimination. Such a policy would shift much of the burden of proof from the individual to the employer and would help a whole category of people rather than just the individual claimant. This is how affirmative action was born. Affirmative action. Affirmative action refers to programs aimed at giving women, minorities, and other governmentally recognized disadvantaged groups new opportunities in employment, education, and in other areas of public and private life. Affirmative action represented something new. Earlier civil rights policies had targeted what's called de jure discrimination, which is discrimination based on the law, de jure discrimination, as in the case of state laws mandating segregated schools. In contrast, affirmative action targeted what's called de facto discrimination, the situation where historically disadvantaged groups claim fewer benefits and opportunities because of systematic prejudice and the effects of historical discrimination. Attempts to enact efforts at affirmative action began when Presidents Johnson and Nixon issued executive orders requiring recipients of federal grants and contracts to take steps to give historically disadvantaged groups equal opportunity. Affirmative action shifted the burden of proof to the provider. For instance, if a federal contractor hired a nearly all-male workforce, he or she could be asked to provide a compelling reason for the imbalance identified as a concern by the government. If the contractor failed to do so, the contract could be canceled by the government agency. As affirmative action policies rolled out through the government and other public agencies, it was met with growing opposition by the American public. Polls indicated that most Americans, though widely agreeing that women and minorities should have an equal opportunity in the public sphere, were opposed to giving them preferential or protected treatment as a means of alleviating past injustices. In a 1977 poll, for example, more than 7 times as many respondents expressed opposition to preferential treatment than supported it. Not surprisingly, affirmative action has been the target of countless lawsuits in the intervening years. In 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled for the first time on affirmative action in the case University of California versus Bakke. and Labaki, a white male, had been denied admission to the University of California Medical School, even though his test scores were higher than several successful minority applicants. Labaki sued the school, claiming that it violated his 14th Amendment equal protection rights by setting aside a specific number of admission slots for minority applicants. The Supreme Court ruled in Baki's favor, saying that the school's quota system was unconstitutional. Quota system. However, the court simultaneously confirmed that the government has a compelling interest in fostering an equal society. It said that race could be taken into account in admissions decisions, along with other factors such as an applicant's extracurricular activities, as long as race was not the decisive factor. The net result of the Baki decision: race-based quotas were unconstitutional, but affirmative action itself was not necessarily so. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court began to narrow the scope of affirmative action that it deemed constitutional. In a key decision, the court invalidated a federal law that set aside a percentage of federal contracts for minority-owned businesses. The court ruled that affirmative action had to be narrowly tailored, and that the government had to have a compelling reason for granting racial preferences. In essence, a minority-owned firm cannot benefit simply from the fact that other such firms, at some point in the past, had been discriminated against. To allow that, said the court's majority, would be to violate the equal protection rights of competing firms here in the present moment. Affirmative action is still present in U.S. society. It simply has been hemmed in by ethical questions that it continues to raise. Similarly, there has emerged a widespread belief in the United States that women, by either corporate policy or by corporate culture, often earn less in the American workplace than do their male counterparts as a result of systematic sex discrimination. Proponents today call for additional protections for the civil rights of women in the workforce, including expanded federal paid leave policies and government-supported childcare. Facts are clear. Women often do earn less than their male counterparts in the workplace, and often do shoulder more familiar responsibility than do their male husbands, partners, and coworkers. However, proponents of new civil rights legislation, for instance, the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, fail to account for the role that cultural norms, individual family preferences, and sheer biology, childbirth, play in shaping the American workforce. In truth, it has been illegal to discriminate, to pay women less than their male colleagues for the same work since John F. Kennedy was in office. Women today comprise the majority of American voters, the wide majority of American college goers, and will likely, in your lifetime, even comprise a majority of the American workforce. Women who earn less than men today in the same or similar roles often do so quite intentionally. That is, they avoid the types of behavior, signing up for overnight shifts, overtime hours, etc., that can generate the upward mobility and pay increases that are more frequently undertaken by their male counterparts. Frequently, they're moms who put a bigger priority on family than on corporate advancement. We should respect these choices, but I digress. Like so-called equal pay for women, it is common to hear politicians describe specific causes as the civil rights issue of our time. Human trafficking, police brutality, school choice, paid family leave, burdensome medical and student loan debt, etc. Efforts to expand the individual protection of rights by government will continue, and often in ways we cannot easily predict. But we can know this for sure. Those who succeed in winning recognition of new civil rights protections will win their argument, case by case, year after year, and they will ground their evidence in the shared ideals held by Jefferson and America's founders. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.